With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halvorson.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning on the AgNet News Hour, an industry group that is looking for a continuation of direct oversight of Mexican avocado exports. We'll tell you why. But we start the day with a conversation on climate change. Sideline held a press briefing on the topic Tuesday with Professor Melissa Lott, a professor of practice at Columbia's Climate School. She's also the former director of research at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Here are some of her comments on the issue of climate change.
I am a professor at Columbia University's Climate School. And what I look at and what I've looked at for the past couple of decades is how do we actually design and execute pathways towards net zero, which is where we found a balance between the greenhouse gas emissions that we're putting into the air and those that we're pulling out. And why we want to do that is to stabilize climate change, to prevent as much future damage as we can. So by way of a little bit of background, what we have seen when it comes to the climate science is that climate change is actually happening faster and probably more severely than we expected. This is partially a product of, as scientists, we like to be conservative. So I am going to give you the bottom of the band when it comes to potential damages. I'm going to give you, okay, it's this or more, it's at least this much damage. But what we're finding out is actually that impacts that we thought we would be seeing with climate change that wouldn't be happening for many more years, and higher temperature changes are already happening. I'm going to give one reference, which is just my go-to source when it comes to looking at what effects are we seeing of climate change already. It's called the Lancet Countdown, and it tracks what are the health impacts, what are the economic impacts of climate change as we go on, and also how much progress are we making towards solving climate change, particularly in the energy sector, which I'll get to in a minute. So just as a couple of examples, we're seeing rapidly rising deaths from heat-related incidences, and also a global drop in productivity because of things like heat waves, but also just increasingly hot trends. And that is particularly impacting low-income economies, low-income countries around the world that have a lot more people who work outdoors, or even if they work indoors, do not have access to a lot of air conditioning, which is a tool that actually keeps us safe within our homes and our offices. We're also seeing severe storms here in the US. And, I'm from Texas, so you don't have to tell me about hurricanes and what's going on right now. There's still, as of this morning, 1 million people who are without power. But we're just seeing more and more of this happening, these severe storms, this flooding, increased disease transmission, et cetera. So climate change is happening faster than we expected. So if we want to solve it, we're really talking mostly about an energy transition. And I say that because 3/4 roughly of global emissions, similar numbers here in the US, are from energy, the energy sector, which includes a bunch of different things, not just power plants, but power plants, as well as transportation, different ways that we use energy in buildings, and different ways that we use energy in industry. So producing the dyes that made this clothing a dark gray, for producing all the things that we want to use in our lives. So the good stuff is, if you know where the problem's coming from, you can target it and solve it. And further good news, which I'll get into in a minute, is we have most of the technologies that we need to actually get to a solution, which is something that comes up and I'm asked about all the time. Do we have what we need to actually do this thing and to get there quickly? And quickly is the key point here, because when we look at the impacts of climate change on our health and the environment, which all relates to the health of our economies, what we're seeing is that we want to meet climate goals, and we want to meet them very rapidly, because rapid movement is actually a much cheaper option than slow movement. So getting quicker to net zero, bringing emissions down, will result in less damage and be economically better for all of us than if we move slowly. There is a complication there where some of the damages of climate change are paid for with one bucket, for instance, like an insurance bill or a healthcare bill, where the solutions are paid through our energy bills and through our food bills and other things. But backing up for a minute, when we talk about rapid transition, I'll point to this graph on the left, which shows global, again, net CO2 emissions, so greenhouse gas emissions. Noah talked a bunch about those, and how quickly we need to get emissions down. And as you can see, that isn't what we've been doing in the past, and we're all familiar with this. We've been going up, now we want to go down, and we need to go down rapidly. And the more we delay, the sharper that slope is. So how quickly we need to come down so that we can control cumulative emissions. Within the transition, we have to think about both mitigating, bringing down emissions, but also adapting, because we have existing and kind of baked in climate impacts that we actually have to adapt in our lives too. So we are already seeing heat waves. We're already seeing the things I talked about before. So how do we reduce emissions? And I want to zoom in on the US. And this is a summary of more than, hundreds, if not more than 1,000 different studies that have been done over decades by researchers at many universities. And when I boil them all down and I summarize them, what it says is the cheapest and most effective way to get to net zero, to bring down emissions around all these different parts of the economy. And Noah showed y'all this chart from the EPA before, which shows where emissions are coming from. Again, transportation being the biggest one, electric power being next, industry behind that, then our residential, commercial buildings, and agriculture. If we want to get it down, what do we do? Well, in the energy sector, the first thing we do is we electrify everything that makes sense to electrify while becoming as efficient as possible. We don't electrify everything, but we electrify a lot of things. So we probably electrify our personal vehicles. We probably electrify how we heat water and cook in our homes. We probably don't electrify long haul flights, and we probably don't electrify shipping because those things don't make sense economically. We have other solutions for them, like drop-in fuel replacements and other things I can get into as you like. The second thing we do is clean up that electricity mix because, of course, if we just are switching from one source of emissions to another, it may be better, but it's not going to get us all the way to a goal of solving climate change. And then we clean up everything else. So we create liquid fuels, we create feedstocks for industry so that we can create the things we want in our lives, that we want to use in our lives, but not produce these emissions that are harming our lives as the same step.
You are listening to the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. In today's National Spotlight, Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific, USDA will update the monthly World Agriculture Supply and Demand Estimates report. This month, it will include the updated information from the just-released U.S. acreage and grain stocks figure, both of which have pressured the price of corn. Frayne Olson, a crops economist from North Dakota State University, explains how these numbers will be incorporated.
Just to go through the math really quick, just to understand the grain stocks inventories for the old crop inventories, then feed back into the beginning stocks for the new crop. And so we have this linkage always between what's going on in old crop, what's happening in new crop. Okay, so we're obviously there's going to be adjustments in the old crop inventories because we got the inventory report. And just for clarity, that's a combination of a survey of on-farm inventories that farmers report, as well as the reports from commercial storage or commercial inventories as well. So is there margin for error in the inventories numbers? Yes. We see those. It's usually used as a benchmark to say how quickly we're burning through our inventories, especially for corn, because it's very hard to get a good read on the amount of whole corn that goes into the livestock sector, because it oftentimes doesn't necessarily go across a scale and can count it very well. Okay, so old crop inventories from last year get brought forward into new crop inventories for this year. So when we look at the 2024-25 ending stocks numbers for corn and beans as well as for wheat, there's going to be two adjustments. As you said, the inventories from last year are from the old crop, from the June report, and adjustments in the planted acreage. So planted acreage then gets transferred into harvested acreage. So there's a conversion factor. Now, typically this time of year, USDA doesn't make a lot of changes in that conversion factor. They kind of assume the long-term average. And that really, the most of that reflects the amount of corn silage that's harvested. So just because corn has been planted doesn't mean that it's going to be harvested for grain. And on the WASDE report, we're counting bushels of grain, not necessarily just corn. The corn silage numbers are taken out because that's calculated separately. Okay, so the other possible adjustment then, I don't think they'll adjust that ratio, the relationship between planted and harvested acres. That's unusual at this time of year. It's also unusual that they're going to make any adjustments in the yield projections. Now, that sometimes happens, but it's typically, again, very, very small. So I don't anticipate any yield adjustments. Okay, so now we've got, several adjustments going on the production side. Well, with the increased production, we also have lower prices, which means we'll likely get a slight bump in some of the usage numbers as well. So there's a lot of moving parts now in this June or the July report. They're going to be, in my opinion, small adjustments, a little bit here, a little bit there, and all of a sudden things start to add up. And that bottom line number for ending stocks, the forecasted ending stocks for a new crop, can bounce around quite a bit. Now, again, my expectation, I have not seen the pre-report industry estimates yet, kind of that survey information that the industry collects. But I am expecting the number for corn in particular to go up simply because we did have an increase in ending stocks the inventories from the June report from last year. We know that we're going to have an increase in planted acreage because, as you mentioned, the World Board will use the NASS numbers for planted acreage. Some of the adjustments on the consumption numbers will be really interesting to watch. Typically, when we see an increase in production, we also see an increase in feed and wastage. So there's a feed and wastage number that comes in. That tends to be our biggest shock absorber when we end up with more grain. It will also be interesting to me, are they going to try and bump or adjust the exports numbers? Because that's the other one that we can see some tweaking on for consumption, especially as prices go down. As the World Board estimates, they think that the United States will be competitive with some of the grain coming out of, in particular, Brazil. So the expectation is for higher numbers. Obviously, we don't know what those numbers will be, but there's going to be a lot of little moving parts as we go through this process.
That's today's National Spotlight. Now here's the livestock report. USDA recently announced an expansion of one of its emergency disaster assistance programs in efforts to assist dairy growers impacted by the H5N1 virus. Rod Bain reports.
The latest USDA effort to provide support to dairy producers with herds impacted by the H5N1 virus involves an updated version of USDA's Emergency Assistance for Livestock, Honeybees, and Farm-Raised Fish program.
Designed now to provide assistance to dairy producers who are incurring milk losses as a result of H5N1.
Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack recently explained the update in a visit with reporters. An update now published in the Federal Register.
Under the program, as we've designed it, farmers will receive payments at a 90% coverage of lost production, retroactive to the date in March of 2024 of their first positive herd.
Eligibility requirements for milk loss assistance under ELAP include:
the adult dairy cow must be the following. Must be part of a herd that has had a confirmed positive H5N1 test from the National Veterinary Services Laboratory. Must have been initially removed from commercial milk production during the 14-day time period before the sample collection date for the positive H5N1 test date, through 120 days after the sample collection date for the positive test. To be milk producing, currently lactating, and maintained for commercial milk production on the beginning date of the eligible loss condition. Now, producers must also have risk in the owned, cash leased, purchased, or having been a contract grower of eligible adult dairy cows for at least 60 days before the beginning of the production loss to essentially participate in this program. And the coverage is also going to be provided on a per cow basis for a period of up to 4 weeks per cow.
Other details within the Federal Register notice on expanded ELAP include needed documentation and payment calculations. Applications will be accepted through local Farm Service Agency offices through January 30th of next year. Secretary Vilsack adds that the coverage under ELAP
is going to build on the efforts that we've made to ensure that we're limiting the spread of the virus as it's detected. While dairy cows impacted and affected with H5N1 generally recover after a few weeks, and there's little mortality associated with this disease, it does dramatically limit milk production for a period of time, which obviously causes economic loss for producers with affected premises. And for that reason, we've chosen to support farmers with the ELAP program to offset those losses.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Don't forget, if you've missed any of our morning shows or if you simply need to catch the news at a different time, you can subscribe to our podcast and have statewide agriculture news at your convenience. All you have to do is search for the AgNet News Hour on your favorite podcast downloading app. We will be back in just a moment with more agriculture news. Coming up in a few moments, we'll have today's This Land of Ours report, but first, more of the day's agriculture news. And with a preview of what you'll hear today on AgNet West, here's Brian Derming.
The California Avocado Commission stresses the importance of the U.S.-Mexico Operational Work Plan for avocado inspections. The plan requires the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service to directly inspect Hass avocados in Mexico before they're exported to the U.S. The purpose is to ensure no invasive pests are introduced. Representing about 3,000 avocado growers in California, the commission argues that this oversight is crucial, especially given reports of corruption and violence in Mexico. They fear that without USDA control, U.S. farmers' economic interests and pest control efforts would be compromised. Despite a temporary suspension of inspections due to security concerns, the USDA has started to resume them. The Commission urges the USDA to maintain its direct inspection role to protect U.S. agriculture. The U.S. Department of Agriculture is looking to change import inspection fees for fresh produce. USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service is proposing changes to how fresh fruits, vegetables, and other products are inspected and certified. Announced on June 20th, these revisions include a new per-pound fee for certain import inspections and a 50% reduction in the sublot fee. The current method of measuring loads by container count will be updated to include modern shipping methods like bulk containers, air freight, and rail cars. This change aims to better reflect the actual time and resources needed for inspections. A minimum fee will be set at either a 2-hour charge or the per-pound fee, whichever is higher, helping shippers accurately assess inspection costs. Written comments on the proposal are due by August 19th and can be submitted online, by fax, or by mail. The U.S. Department of Agriculture is still accepting nominations for farmers and ranchers to serve on local Farm Service Agency county committees. With less than a month left to submit nominations, FSA Administrator Zach Ducheneau highlights the makeup and intent of the committees.
So far as I know, the county committee is the only place where citizen stakeholders have an opportunity to weigh in on the policy deployment at a local level and ensure their interests are being represented. The county committees are anywhere from 3 to 9 members. In some cases, we might have a couple of counties combined and they have a little bigger representation to make sure we're getting proper distribution. The county committee is going to weigh in on applications that are made for certain programs, help the local office make eligibility determinations, and really provide eyes and ears out there for national and state policymakers to help understand how the policy is landing in the local communities.
The California Department of Food and Agriculture is continuing efforts to support the development of sustainable crop protection options for growers. CDFA Secretary Karen Ross highlighted some of their work to address pest management in California.
We have had some discretionary one-time dollars for sustainable pest management, which for us was restarting a program that the university used to fund, and it hasn't been funded for 15 years, biologically integrated farming systems. Very popular. It's a way of bringing a whole commodity group or a whole region around a particular pest issue, and then doing the trials, engaging the growers, providing technical expertise, and we've been able to fund a few of those programs over the last 3 or 4 years. We're also making funding for what we call proactive IPM, which you always have to wonder, are we just sending people to chase, the good pests? But you can start to see, what if X came here? What would we have in our toolbox as early as possible? Because the chances of that happening are very, very real. And so we've had some good projects proposed for that one. And then, of course, we've been able to bump up some of our funding in IR4, which does important work, especially for our specialty crops, which don't have the acreage and tend to get overlooked in the development of new products, trying to get the trial work done, get the data so that it's easier for registrants to start their registration process.
The California Department of Pesticide Regulation is still seeking feedback on its statewide pesticide notification program. DPR's released modifications to its proposed pesticide application notification regulation and will be accepting public comment through August 1st. Once in effect, the regulation will support the statewide implementation of a first-of-its-kind system to provide advance information on the planned applications of restricted material pesticides used in agriculture. 3 regulatory hearings highlighting the proposal are being held July 12th, 15th, and 23rd. Following the close of the current public comment period, DPR will finalize the regulation and system design in preparation for statewide implementation of the notification system in the first quarter of 2025. Additional details about the proposed regulation are available at cdpr.ca.gov. I'm Brian German for AgNet West Radio Network.
A webinar to help with farmers under stress. That's coming up on this Land of Ours. The Penn State University Extension is holding a webinar titled Communicating with Farmers Under Stress. The event is aimed at helping participants learn the signs of stress and how to help. It's scheduled for 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Time on August 6th. The program is designed for agriculture industry professionals, loan officers, family members of farmers, and concerned citizens. It will cover how to communicate with and respond to farmers and their family members when they need assistance. The webinar will help participants learn to build awareness of the stressors affecting some farmers and their families, and to recognize the signs and symptoms of anxiety and the warnings of suicide. The webinar is free, but attendees must register before the webinar starts to get the access link. For more information or to sign up, go to the Penn State Extension website at extension.psu.edu. You're listening to the AgNet News Hour. Gary Crawford has this week's Agriculture USA.
What you're hearing there is a sound recorded at a busy but very small rural hospital. It may be the only hospital within 35 to 100 miles, making it a vital asset to those it serves. But right now, some of these hospitals are under attack from enemies unseen and unknown. There's actually a sort of a war going on with the fate of some of these hospitals and their patients hanging in the balance. We'll find out more coming up on this edition of Agriculture USA. I'm Gary Crawford.
We have seen over 100% increase in cyber attacks against hospitals, notably the 18 to 2100 rural hospitals across the country.
Every rural hospital needs to be concerned about this.
The voices of Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack and Ann Neuberger. She is the White House Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology. She says hackers have been targeting rural medical facilities.
They seek to lock the systems and press the hospital to pay a ransom, to pay a sum of money, usually in cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency can move quickly. It bypasses our traditional banking and anti-money laundering, usually to pay a ransom via cryptocurrency to the criminals. And in fact, in the United States, we see hundreds of affected companies and hospitals have been paying, hundreds of millions of dollars in ransoms to criminals largely based in Russia.
In some cases, hackers lock up the hospital's financial and administrative side. At least one rural hospital in Illinois, for example, has had to shut down totally because they couldn't do billing or insurance work or any of that sort of thing. But Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack says sometimes hackers have been able to lock up medical equipment that is connected to the internet.
The seriousness of this is that it's not just the business aspect of the operation, it's also the impact it can have on patients not being able to access critical care at a critical period of time. So lives are at stake.
Vilsack says rural hospitals are particularly vulnerable to cyber attacks.
Because they may be understaffed and they may not have the sophisticated technology that perhaps a large tertiary care center would have.
And so,
due to the increased threat environment, hospitals really need to improve their cybersecurity.
Ann Neuberger says the federal government is teaming up with Microsoft and Google to help rural hospitals do just that.
For independent critical access hospitals and rural emergency hospitals, Microsoft will provide grants and up to a 75% discount on their technology products for smaller organizations. They will also provide, for those who are already using Microsoft products, their most advanced security suite at no additional cost, and they'll provide free cybersecurity assessments and free training for frontline and IT staff at rural hospitals to help them understand, how to look for these threats and how to defend against them.
And as far as what Google is going to be doing?
Google will provide cybersecurity advice to rural hospitals at no cost. And they've set up a pool of money to support updating software to make it more defensible. And Google's set up a pilot program to work recognizing that rural hospitals may use different kinds of technology products to work with rural hospitals to try to customize security that works within the hospital environment that's in place in rural hospitals.
And so this project is a lot more than just helping hospitals with equipment.
The effort really starts with both Microsoft and Google giving free cybersecurity training to work with staff at each hospital to help assess where is the hospital in terms of its cybersecurity risk. And then there is both free and a 75% discount on security products for such smaller hospitals.
All of this part of a major effort
to provide the resources and the training necessary for hospitals to protect themselves.
To find out more about this project, you can go online to Google and look for rural-health at google.com. Rural-health at google.com. This has been Agriculture USA. I'm Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
USDA recently issued its fiscal year 2023 study of trends within several of its domestic food and nutrition assistance programs. Rod Bain has details.
What trends were reflected within federal domestic food and nutrition assistance programs over the course of the past fiscal year? That is the focus of an annual study and report presented by USDA's Economic Research Service. Jordan Jones is among the economic researchers co-authoring the report for fiscal year 2023. He starts with some context.
We're focusing on that period from October 22 through September 2023. This was a time period where we still saw the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and the policy responses that were in place and implemented in response to the pandemic. But then we also in 2023 saw the end of the public health emergency declaration and the expiration of many of the temporary programs and provisions that were implemented in response to the pandemic. So we also saw program participation and spending respond accordingly.
As for the breakdown of findings within the Food and Nutrition Assistance Landscape Report for the prior fiscal year,
total spending for the year was about $166 billion, which is a lot and well above any pre-pandemic peak, but down from the peak in 2021 of $202 billion adjusted to 2023 dollars.
Delving further into specific programs, Jones starts with the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program.
SNAP participation increased in 2023 to about 42 million people per month on average, and that came out to about a 12.6% national participation rate. In terms of developments, we saw a sizable increase in the regular benefit for the year, but there was also the expiration of supplemental emergency allotments midway through the years. So overall benefit levels fell and spending on SNAP fell.
Turning to the Women, Infants, and Children program,
WIC participation increased in 2023 to about 6.6 million per month, and 2023 was also the first year since 2009 that we saw participation increase for all three of the participant groups. And WIC was also the only major program that we covered for which spending increased last year to $6.6 billion.
Regarding collective child nutrition programs,
they had their first full school year in fiscal year 2023 that was after the expiration of some important waivers that allowed free meals for all students regardless of income and also increased meal reimbursement rates for the previous school year. And following those expirations, we saw total spending fall to $27 billion in 2023. And then meals served for the school meal programs and other child nutrition programs combined fell to about 8.8 billion meals for the year.
Jones adds FY23 was the final year for the temporary pandemic electronic benefit transfer program.
PEBT was implemented in 2020 as a response to the pandemic to get some benefits to families whose children lost out on school meals because of the pandemic and those disruptions. It was its last year in 2023, and so PEBT was kind of winding down and issued fewer benefits, about $13.7 billion.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
This is the AgNet News Hour. We will be back in just a moment with more agriculture news. Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. In this week's Almond Matters, brought to you by Valent USA. Harvest is not too far away, and growers will want to get ahead of any ant problems out in the orchard.
In this week's Almond Matters, we're joined once again by Todd Berkdahl, Field Market Development Specialist with Valent USA. And now we are talking pest management options today, and with hull split here, that means that harvest won't be too far behind. And so, Todd, what's that going to mean for addressing any ant problems that might be encountered out in the orchard?
Harvest is, right around the corner here, coming up probably early August. And so getting ants knocked out or reducing the population, managing it down to a really low population, ideally knocking them out 100%, because once those nuts hit the ground, they're shook off the trees. That becomes, a smorgasbord for ants, and especially with varieties that are, softer shells on them. The harder shell stuff is a little more. It's not impervious to ants, but it's harder for them. They'll go after the softer shells. Typically on a high crop year, which I think we're up against this year, nuts tend to be a little bit smaller, and usually the shells are a little tighter. So that may be an advantage just naturally. However, there's still ants out there. There's basically two species. There's the southern fire ant, and then there's the pavement ant. And they're both damaging. The southern fire ant probably bigger target as far as potential damage. But they're both protein feeders, and they'll both damage ants. So, and left unchecked, they can do significant damage to the nuts. Basically, they eat out the inside, and then you have a blank or a partial kernel. Getting a product on, typically bait is the best way to use to go after them. And the thing about baits is they're pretty effective because the ants eat the bait. That's a food source for them. They take it back to the colony, and their colonies are subterranean, typically underneath the ground. Most of them nest in the ground, and then they feed it to the young or the brood there, and so you potentially wipe out the whole colony. I know that sounds kind of cruel, but it's either that or take damage on the nuts. But that's what you want to do, is you want to wipe out the whole entire colony. The thing about baits is there's a couple of caveats. You don't want to put it on right before irrigation, and you don't want to put it on right after an irrigation. You want to leave about 2 or 3 days after an irrigation, ground's dried out a little bit, when you put a bait on. And if you put it on before an irrigation, it gets the bait wet, and it becomes less desirable, I guess you could say, for the ants. So you want a fresh food source, and keeping it wet. The weather we've been having, hot and dry, it shouldn't be any problem to irrigate and then come back a day or two later and put your bait out. A lot of guys have already put bait out just because they're proactive and got it on there. One less thing you got to worry about. Keep in mind there's differences in baits, different the way they kill. I work for Valen. We sell a steam ant bait, which is an insect growth regulator. And I mean insect growth regulator, meaning that basically it stops the molting process from going for the larva to go into to be adults. And it also sterilizes the queen. So when the queen is fed bait with pyriproxyfen, the steam ant bait on it, that bait will, or the active ingredient causes the queen to be sterile. So the eggs she lays are not viable. And then the larvae don't mold out to be adults. It kind of really fouls things up within the colony. It's not a fast acting material. It takes about anywhere from 7 to 8, 9 days to see complete mortality, but it is very effective. Once at very low doses too as well. Doesn't take much steam ant bait to wipe out an entire colony. And so getting it on early is always, early is always better, I think, than later. Once you put it on, and you're going to be shaking in the next 3 or 4 days and put a steam ant bait out, it's probably too late. Not probably, it's too late. You need to get it on well in advance of the shaking, so that they can feed and they can, the products have time to work in the colonies. That's my take on it. I would put it on too late. You're going to be competing the ant bait with the nuts on the ground. So, they might go to the nuts instead of the bait. So, or bait's, insignificant compared to the volume of nuts on the ground. So they're overwhelmed by nuts and they just feed on nuts. So getting on before you shake is advantageous to controlling ants.
So because it's not fast-acting, getting an insect growth regulator out there for ants, if growers see some ant activity going on out in the orchard after putting out some bait, it's not cause for alarm immediately. Just give it time, but also give yourself time for it to do its job before shaking, right?
Yes, steam is an IGR. I'm talking about steam specifically. Steam is an IGR, so it needs to be taken back to the colony, and then the members of the colony ingest it, and once they've imbibed of it, it's lights out. Again, it's sterility for the female, the queen. She's laying eggs that are not viable, and then the larvae that they're being fed it. The protein-based bait, they don't go on to being adults. They just stifles it. It basically knocks out the whole entire colony.
This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. What about humates and animal feed? When can you add humates to the animal feed, and what is the benefit of that?
So the interesting thing about animal feeds is just like the fertilizer side, there's actually a lot going on in legislative processes. So there's an act out called the Innovative Feed Act. And currently, you can't include things in animal feed that are giving you other benefits besides nutritive benefits. Let's say, for example, you had a cow that was eating a product that reduced its methane emissions, that those enteric gases that are caused just in the natural digestion of a ruminating cow. You can't claim that those products do that benefit. So hopefully people will get involved and say, look, the Innovative Feed Act is necessary and should help farmers. Other benefits of feeding humate is obviously first to reduce enteric gases. But the second one, these are old plant materials. So those plant materials are rich in trace minerals. So not only are you getting something that's going to help the digestion of the animal, you're also getting an abundant supply of minerals. So that is the main reason farmers are currently including in their animal feeds.
This is all fascinating, but it can be hard to retain some of this information when you're hearing this on the radio or through the podcast. So, is there someplace online, or where can our listeners go and get more information?
Well, the good news is the acts I mentioned, like the Innovative Feed Act and the Plant Biostimulant Act, are publicly available through Congress. You can actually go look at those acts. They're on the website there. The other information you can get is directly through Live Earth products. So if you go to liveearth.com, contact us. You can contact us and our agronomy team. And we're happy to go over any details, questions about how to use these products, how they fit your farm program, how to use them as a tool to implement conservation practices such as nutrient retention, water conservation, and improving soil health.
To get to know more about Live Earth products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEARTH.com. You are listening to the AgNet News Hour. Now for more news. Selected communities now have assistance in developing wildfire defense plans, thanks in part to recently awarded U.S. Forest Service grants. Rod Bain reports.
As communities and urban forest interface areas prepare for potential wildfire threats, one tool that can assist is USDA Community Wildfire Defense Grants.
The grant really has two primary purposes to it. One is to help communities develop community wildfire protection plans, or what's commonly referred to as CWPPs. The other thing is projects that are described in a community wildfire protection plan.
Brad Simpkins of the U.S. Forest Service explains a community wildfire protection plan.
That is basically the planning document. It's a collaborative process where all the stakeholders come together and say, what are our risks with our community? Where are our issues? Where do we need to do work? How do we try to prevent a wildfire coming into our community and doing damage?
And regarding funding for projects listed under a community wildfire protection plan, the plan itself.
For purposes of this program, it has to be a fairly recent one. It can't be more than 10 years old. And so that's for communities that have already taken that step to get together and plan and say, okay, here's our problem areas. Here's where we need to go and do work to protect our community or at least mitigate the risks.
Recently, the Forest Service announced the latest grant awards for the Community Wildfire Defense Grant Program.
We pushed out about $250 million for round two, and that funded 158 applications out of those 535. Funding actually went to 31 different states, 11 tribes, and 2 territories, both Palau in the Pacific and Puerto Rico in the Atlantic.
This is year 2 of the Community Wildfire Defense Grant Program. Its focus on wildfire response plans is part of the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy and is aligned with the National Climate Resilience Framework.
It's really meant to do things before a wildfire starts. It's how do you decrease fuels, create fire breaks, prevention, etc., to get ready and try to mitigate the risk before the fire ever occurs.
Simpkins says some adjustments were made to the application process for CWDG after the initial round of awards last year.
Listening to applicants, states, etc. after round one of the things we heard was it would be nice if you could prioritize the planning in round 2, because a requirement of this program is if you're asking for funding for a project, it has to be in a community wildfire protection plan that's less than 10 years old. So the decision was made in round 2 to prioritize community wildfire protection plans.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
U.S. agricultural export values continue to lag behind a year ago as imports continue growing. Gary Crawford reports.
U.S. ag exports continue to slow. Ag imports continue to grow. USDA economist James Kaufman says we now have complete trade numbers for the first 8 months of this fiscal year, October through May. And here's what the numbers say.
Agricultural exports in May were at $13.7 billion, down almost 2% from the previous May. This puts U.S. exports for fiscal year 2024 at $122.4 billion, 5% or $6 billion lower than the same period in fiscal 2023.
And meanwhile, we're importing more ag products, 4% more than by this time a year ago.
Import growth has been spurred by a relatively strong U.S. economy and a strong dollar, which makes imports less expensive.
Kaufman says so far this year we're running a $15 billion ag trade deficit with the rest of the world. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
That's today's top agriculture news. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. Thank you for sharing your morning with us.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West online at agnetwest.com. You can also stay connected by following us on our social media at AgNet West on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also find our broadcast team of Brian German and Sabrina Halvorson on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for listening to the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.